Mark, thank you so much for taking the time. Really, really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to our conversation for quite some time after getting known to you within the Sprint anti-drone challenge, Funke. Please, for the people who don't know you, give us a short overview. Who is Marc Lange?
Yeah, first of all, let me say that it's an outrageous pleasure to be on my favorite podcast. Thanks for having me. I'm blushing. You just don't see it because I'm German. Two Germans working on the German Day of Unity, right? It's got to be something. So I'm an advisor, mostly focusing on unmanned systems. I usually talk to governments, MODs, supranational bodies, and to investors. And the whole topic that I'm devoting all of my 7 days to is to make sense of what's out there and make sure that people make the right decisions. They don't make FOMO purchases. They take what's being used in Ukraine, but translate it into NATO doctrine. And I do also extensively write about that, give interviews about that, speak about that at conferences, closed door meetings, and the whole idea that we need to build the arsenal of the free world out of the arsenal of the West that is Ukraine, and somehow make sure that we can get back to deter, so that we don't have to fight a war, is what I dedicate my time to.
I like the spirit of getting back to deter. When is the last time we actually have been in a meaningful position to really deter from your point of view?
That's a very good question, and I really want to ask the question, nuanced question back, which is, who is we? Who are we? And in that sense, I'd say we, if we count the Americans into it, definitely during the Cold War. We've deterred. That was the whole deal. The Cold War was basically infinite amounts of deterrence on both sides. Nothing ended up happening, and that's a good thing. But it wasn't really us, was it? If the United States would have suddenly moved out of Europe, as now we're seeing some of the U.S. capabilities being moved out of NATO countries, then that wouldn't have happened that way, right? We would not have deterred, and I think that's something to think about.
It is indeed, and things have changed quite a bit, and the threats have changed as well. I think we can agree on that. Well, I'd love to just, get right into it. I mean, we agreed that we would really dive deep into this entire topic of the Great Drone War. And if that is a realistic scenario, what are the limitations? What is real? What is hope? And I'd really love to dive deep into all of the details, all of your expertise. And if you've been really, really humble in your introduction, but you do an outrageous amount of work with directly Ukrainian forces. So please share your wisdom with us, your learnings, what you've learned from them, what works, what doesn't work. Over to you. Stage is yours. I really, really want to hear all of the details, and everyone listening, I'm sure, as well.
Thank you. That's setting the bar as low as can get. No, thanks a lot. So let me maybe start not by going to a strategic level, but going down to a tactical level. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
because we can visualize what I'm going to talk about now, right? So a couple of weeks back, people from the Unmanned Systems Forces of Ukraine in the Kharkiv region were out in one of their positions, hardened positions, from which they usually would launch counter drone operations from. Okay, and also drone operations. And this story has been told to me by one of the leaders of the Unmanned Systems Forces. So imagine this. Put yourself into the shoes of these people in that moment. You're in that hardened position, the bunker, and you're getting an alert from the acoustic sensor network that has been deployed across the entire border of Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and across the entire front. And you're getting an alert that something's coming closer. And you're also going to get an alert that what's coming closer is approaching at a very high speed. It's approaching at about 550 kilometers per hour. And as a matter of fact, it could just as well be a jet or a cruise missile, right? But it has a very low radar cross section, and so anyway, it's getting closer. You're pretty sure you know what it is. The moment that you get that alert, it is basically only a minute away from you or two. So what you do is you run out of that bunker, and which is what people did in that moment, and you basically can only see it passing above you, 100 meters above you. You see it passing. And what it is the next version of the Shahed drone, or Geran. Actually, it's called Geranium, and there are lots more names internally with both the Russian forces and the Iranians, which originated this drone. And while many people who are listening to this may have heard of the Shahed drone or the Geran drone, this Dorito-shaped thing that's haunting Ukraine, that is basically killing civilians every day, and with which both infrastructure, but more importantly, cities are being pummeled every night. By now, hundreds, almost 1,000 every night of these drones fly into the cities and cause massive destruction. That was the next version. And as I said, 550 kilometers, the regular ones, the ones that we are getting familiar with now, bit by bit, through the press, they fly at 130 kilometers per hour. If something passes above your head, as you may well be able to tell, at 550 kilometers per hour, at 100 meters, you can do only what the people that were in the situation that I am describing did: watch it pass. They couldn't do a single thing against it. And that, to me, is frightening, because if we now switch over to the reality that we have so far witnessed in terms of drone incursions, and what prompted, obviously, now Ursula von der Leyen, Andrius Kubilius, and all of the European leaders to meet up in the Nordics and discuss the drone wall the other day, were Gerbera drones. Funny side, sorry, Russia names its main drones after plants, flowers, whatever. So Gerbera drones are smaller decoy versions, meaning they're target drones, test drones. They also use them as test platforms of the Shahed. They're way smaller. They're about a good third smaller. They're not made out of nice composite. They're made out of very simple materials, and they're filled with foam. And these things don't really carry a payload. However, we have been completely overwhelmed by those drones and have only been able to shoot down 3 or 4, final verdict is out, of these 19 drones that have entered Polish airspace recently. We've done so at an extreme cost. And so going back to the situation that occurred there in Ukraine, where what Ukraine is dealing with now is that kind of a threat, right? It makes me wonder how we're going to put up a drone wall, because the term wall really gives you this idea that, I'm hitting a wall here, that there's no passing through, right? But right now, all of those hundreds of drones every day, they enter Ukraine, they enter Ukraine. And so are we being a bit arrogant and not humble enough in saying we're going to put up a drone wall? That's my main stance, and I'm happy to elaborate.
Please do. I mean, there's so many things to unpack right away there. So when we see these new threats, right, or the threats in Ukraine to begin with, really, it is at the end really a numbers game. Yeah, it is just overwhelmed the air defense with outrageous numbers, which are ever increasing. And, we feel like by the day are only going up. And we know that there are the ambitions that it's probably at some point going to be thousands or over 1,000 a night on Ukraine alone. And I think everyone is also aware that they are working on ever, increasing these volumes to, produce more than they need at some point. Now, obviously, you described the new threat due to the pure increase of speed, and that is a whole new challenge, which causes a whole new needed evolution in air defense systems. So I'm wondering right now if the country which, I don't think anyone can make an argument about this, but is at the forefront of air defense and, facing this reality of drone warfare, is challenged by, first, the numbers they are being confronted with, even with the slower drones, And now we have this next generation, and they combine those with the sheer amounts of slower and faster drones. How are they approaching that? I mean, what is the solution for that, first, in the scenario for Ukraine? And second, going back to our, I guess, big theme, what does that mean for a NATO alliance and the drone war so many envision?
Right. Very important question. So just as a high level response, and I'll dive in, what Ukraine is doing right now only partially works for NATO, for EU, and for the eastern flank countries. And on top of that, what Ukraine is doing now, and we have to understand this from actually from a sort of a historical perspective, what led to this. They're doing that because they have been denied better means, But let's talk about what Ukraine is doing right now. So Ukraine is applying what I would call a mix of traditional and expedient air defense measures. So you'll see just against the basic threat of drone incursions, and we should also talk about how those actually work, how a layered attack works, layered saturation attack. But just against this basic threat of drone incursions, they might be using anything from World War II machine guns to missiles, to anti-air missiles, to helicopters and airplanes, F-16s among them, to interceptor drones. So there is, and each of those categories that I just mentioned has a variety of measures within them. Another important thing that I just mentioned here, and this is often forgotten in the current debate about emerging defense technology. Everybody wants to throw a kinetic solution at a problem, but you can't throw a kinetic solution at a problem if you don't know where that problem is. So you need to be able to detect, and you need to be able to trace these incursions, right? And what you want to be ideally get to is a as long range as possible detection. That is not easy at all, given the fact that these drones have a very low radar cross section. So there's a lot to unpack in that Ukraine picture, already. And Ukraine again uses a variety of means, going from machine guns to interceptor drones to, when they have them, and if they need to use the missiles against these attacks. For Ukraine, the issue of covering their vast border, which already is around 1,000 kilometers, is a huge issue. And Ukraine has two major shortcomings, and I would caution people not to think that we don't have them. One is money. They simply don't have enough money, enough funds to get the stuff that they need, to procure the means that they need. Obviously, as we all know, Ukraine is very much dependent on military aid right now. And after the United States have dialed down their military aid spending towards Ukraine almost to zero, the EU is stepping up and taking a lot of that. But it's not like that is sufficient right now, as is very obvious, for Ukraine to push back Russia and to as we say, restore a maneuver to the front line. And it's also very obviously not sufficient for Ukraine to actually defend itself from these drone incursions and from these saturation attacks, because otherwise we wouldn't see those drones actually hit the cities, hit the infrastructure. And then on top of that, the other part to this is that Ukraine is missing the specific means and measures that you would want to have to defend against such incursions. So, as many in the audience may or may not be aware, Ukraine has recently stepped up its production of so-called interceptor drones, and that's a topic that I'm sure we'll discuss in more depth here, because they are a very, very interesting, but at the same time also a misunderstood topic. And these interceptor drones alone, Ukraine sets its monthly target, if they haven't updated it yet, at about 10,000. They're not there yet, This is all very much dependent on a supply chain. You mentioned earlier that this is actually it's massed warfare, which is exactly what this is. So it's dependent on the supply chain. It's dependent on the availability of certain things, and it's dependent on the availability of manpower. And Ukraine obviously has a manpower problem. They need to hold the front with a highly depleted force. Some of those dugouts on the front are very empty. Far understaffed and thinned out. And they're trying to do all of this with not enough money. Now, why I just said that I would caution people to not jump ahead and say, like, we don't have that problem, is because I think we do. Because in the end, not having enough money leads to not having enough means at your disposal, or magazine depth, if you want to use a more defense term, to actually counter the saturation attacks. So that's not having enough stuff to sling at the problem. And, number two, not having enough manpower. Here's the deal. A lot, and a very, very much a rising number of the drone incursions are being taken out by the interceptor drones, with some estimates going as high as 30%. And those are one-to-one FPV piloted drones. We're talking about a person using, a pair of goggles to fly something and then hit. And there's actually a ratio to that. It's about 1 to 5. Hit for instance, a Shahed or a Geran drone. Neither do we have the personnel that is trained to do that, nor do we have the personnel in numbers, right? And that is just one small piece in integrated air defense, or as I call it, integrated unmanned air defense, that we don't really have yet, right? And then on top of that, of course, to perform all of the logistics and training and command and control and rotation of people, and in the end also the execution of all of the air defense measures, you need a lot of people, and you need a lot of point defense measures. You need guns, you need all of these systems, mobile systems, and as I just mentioned, means for detection. And I'd say we have a same but different problem to Ukraine, and that's sort of the main point here. Ukraine is really, really good at taking the little that it has and maximizing the outcome with it. And we're at a very early step in this learning curve.
I'd love to jump in a whole bunch of things here. You mentioned interceptor drones are misunderstood. Why?
This is something that happens quite often in defense innovation, that something new comes along, and especially with what I would call the TikTokification of warfare right now, where you just you get bombarded by a stream of successful strike videos, which is also owed to the fact that Ukraine's brigades and now corps are actually doing their own marketing, and makes a lot of sense. Too many people very rapidly jump to the conclusion that this is now the silver bullet that we can use, right? And there are some very some very attractive reasons for thinking that interceptor drones will help us get rid of the Shahed plague that is currently plaguing Ukraine and has started to also hit us. Number one, the whole idea of interceptor drones is that the so-called cost exchange ratio, which is also called loss exchange ratio if you're talking about manned forces, is favorable to the defender. What does that mean? An interceptor drone, if you take something like a Sting, it's developed by a Ukrainian group called Wild Hornets. Something like a Sting interceptor drone costs around 2,500 euros. Even the Gerbera drones that just entered Polish airspace come at 5,000 to 10,000, right? The Shaheds, and obviously all those things are very much estimates. It's not like there's market pricing, but the Shahed drones, which are the main contenders of the saturation attacks in Ukraine, on Ukraine, they come at maybe 40,000, 50,000 on average, and higher price if they are equipped with better sensors, better processing, and so on. So it's great if I can sling something at the problem, which costs, a fraction of it. That's already a really good thing. But of course, you need a lot more than the Interceptor drone. You need an FPV pilot. You need a supply chain that can get you a lot of these Interceptor drones. You need the logistics. You need to make sure that an Interceptor drone is integrated into your layered air defense, which consists of a lot more parts than just a single means. And this is why I'm saying everybody comes out with these silver bullets right now. And it's understandable that's how marketing works, but it also it seems to catch on in politics. It seems to catch on in policy and procurement. And we need to make sure that that is not what we're doing, just trying to buy as many Interceptor drones as possible. Let me give you one very pointy example, not just talk about it generally. So I've just been to Ukraine to actually look at some of these Interceptor drones, as I have a mandate to scout for them. And the average Interceptor drone comes with a range of between 3 and 5 kilometers. And by the way, for everybody listening, because I don't have a picture to hold up, or everybody watching even, an Interceptor drone looks a bit like a racer drone. So it is a quadcopter but with a very elongated center of the body. Looks a bit bullet-shaped, the center of the body, but it has a little bit tighter positioned quadcopter rotors around that body. And that's because it's meant to have a very high forward speed. Right. So I just said 3 to 5 kilometers in range for each of those, right? Battery-driven quadcopters. Okay, cool. Now, one thing that many people in aerospace know, but few people outside of it know, is that horizontal range is not equal to vertical range, and that a range in ideal conditions is not equal to range in adversarial or bad or negative conditions, like something, for instance, bad weather, wind, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just think about the simple problem of taking one of these and we can talk about what it means to have a lot of them and how to get there, but just taking imagine it's just you, Jonas, and you've got an set of FPV goggles on your face right now, and you've got an Interceptor drone, and there that there's Shahed drones coming. Let's say it's the smaller version, the older version, the 136, so the Get On 2, the one that's most being used. So what you do, you want to start flying it from the ground? Well, guess what? They've increased their operational ceiling and the altitude at which they fly at to around 4 kilometers. And guess what? Your horizontal range is not your vertical range. So there's just no way you can do that. What do you need to do against that? Well, you're going to have to operate that drone from a mothership, release it from a much larger drone. And, many solutions like this exist. There are also Quantum Systems recently showed one on, or was it Florian Seibel directly? I'm not sure. On LinkedIn. Basically, we're talking about a much larger winged drone, which carries multiple drones underneath its wings, similar to how fighter jets carry missiles at their hard points. And then you're going to have to bring that up to altitude. And what you're using is the altitude and speed advantage of that drone to make sure that the power that the drone has, that you're flying the Interceptor drone, is sufficient. But that is not even the whole problem that you have to solve. Now you're in the winter skies above Ukraine or the Baltics. It's cloudy. There's very low vision. Now, that drone might have something like basic target recognition. So basically what it will do, and we can talk about autonomy later, because it's a huge topic we need to debunk and unpack.
Yeah.
That drone will draw a box around stuff it sees, and ideally around the right drone. It's has an algorithmic software that does basic image recognition, and then you see that need to fly towards that with this drone and hit it. And guess what? Unfortunately, in 1 out of 4, maybe 5 times, you're not going to hit it until your battery runs out. Right? So then you need to start over. Either take over another drone that's on the mothership drone, or wait for the next mothership to go up. And of course, having such a thing as mothership drones carrying up drones to altitude to counter these Shahed drones carries with it a whole operational circus that you need to make sure that you take care of. You need to make sure that these motherships are serviced, they're refueled, they're, somebody's piloting them. There needs to be a team that helps you, again, detection and tracking, designate the target area where you're going to fly them to. So there's a lot to it, right? And I've just described just you going up there with one Interceptor and trying to hit one Shahed drone. And some of these drone pilots I want to just honor that for a second. They're absolute masters, right? So we often underestimate. We often think like any kid could pick that up. That's absolutely not true, and that's just the simple perspective of downing one Shahed drone with one interceptor drone. If you look at it from as a Ukrainian in Ukraine, if you look at this from a NATO perspective, from a logistics perspective, from a supply chain perspective, a whole different can of worms opens up. Yeah,
It is indeed, and I love that you made this example. And I sure hope that everyone listening in understands the unbelievable complexity we are operating in, because something that frustrates me recently is that lots and lots of people are just suggesting super basic answers to unbelievable complex situations. And I'm sure you've been confronted with that as well, where it's just, guys, you have not thought it through, you don't understand details. And now doing that on a one-on-one basis is complex and difficult enough with the permanently evolving situation. But now it's horrendously complex to scale that up to thousands of these systems operating at the same time, especially if you take into account that Ukraine has about 1,000 kilometers of border, if I'm not mistaken. Now multiply that by 4 or so, and you have the overall NATO border. That is a bloody unbelievable difficult task. And we've only been talking about one interception and interceptor drones. And what you just said is, I think, also fairly key when it comes to the complexities of just hitting a drone in these real life conditions. It's not a still standing drone, which is difficult enough to hit. It's something moving.
Not.
There's wind. There's wind.
Yeah.
There's weather. There's so many things. And now what you already said, and I would have pushed you either way into that direction, is debunking autonomy. And I'd really love to hear your thoughts on the status quo of autonomy on these things, because there are drones which have visual recognition, but it's all optical, and still the hit rate is 1 to 4, 1 to 5, what you just already mentioned. So can you give us all an overview of where we stand when it comes to autonomous systems?
Yeah, wow, that's another big can of worms, because of course it sounds extremely tempting, right? To just get a lot of autonomous drones and then just have those secure our borders. Sounds like the only solution, really. And I'm gonna explain later that it might be the only solution for the missing layer in our air defense that we have. Although the verdict there is still out, but it sounds very tempting because, again, like enough people realize we don't have the forces. Also, we can't train them in time. There's just no way. And by the way, our beautiful NATO eastern flank border, it's not just very accessible plains like in Ukraine. It's also very rocky, mountainous. You can't just station and position stuff there everywhere. So this idea of there's a robot army attacking us, right? So can we make an autonomous robot army to just hit back? It sounds good. It basically gets us at the whole superhero core of what we want to be. But I think the big problem here is that let's just say, if it's not impossible, it's extremely darn hard. Many companies right now, and I understand that this is, again, how marketing works, because you're not going to get around, like, if everybody calls their system AI, you're going to have to call it AI, etc., etc. They're running around saying our system is fully autonomous. Well, if it's fully autonomous, then why the hell are most systems in the Ukraine, most of the interceptor drones, still piloted until killed? Why? How is that? How, is Ukraine, as the absolute leader on the journey towards drone autonomy, and I'm happy to elaborate, is Ukraine not smart enough to use their own systems? That can't be the case, right? So Let's unpack it. I'm pretty sure you have a rice cooker or know somebody who has a rice cooker, right?
Sure.
You're
Yeah,
like,
of
what the
course.
hell is he talking? Good.
What a question.
Like,
No,
Mark had a
it's a
stroke right
rhetorical
now.
question.
All right. So by the standards of what people call autonomy today, I'd say that's an autonomous robot. And yeah, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but rice cookers are also autonomous robots if what's out there in the drone space is really autonomous. And we need to make a couple of very clear distinctions here. Okay, an algorithmically deterministic system, or even a probabilistic system with certain thresholds, and I'll explain that in a second, is not autonomous. The idea of autonomy is basically that the system is intelligent, that the system can make complex decisions on its own. What does that mean? Well, that means, for instance, that I'll just send that drone up, and it has what's called a kill box. That's the designated 3D, three-dimensional area where it is basically allowed for the system to just act and kill. Has a kill box above me. Let's say we dedicate a no-fly zone and whatnot, and in there it's just going to seek and destroy everything. Well, that works to a certain extent. It's not like we haven't had missiles with heat seekers for many decades. It's not like that's a new thing, or even with visual recognition systems. But that's not really autonomy. Let's think about a situation where we're trying to. Let's go back into the situation that I've described before, where you've got your drone and you want to take out that Shahed drone that's in the sky. Okay, let's say now you're not piloting that drone. That drone is just up there, and it's on that mothership drone. And because a Shahed drone is being detected as in the area, this drone gets released. Okay, cool. Gets released. It starts moving towards some designated target area where the Shahed drone is supposed to arrive when the drone arrives there. And mind you, these drones go 350 kilometers per hour. So, and you're moving towards something that flies at some 130 kilometers per hour in the case of the slow Shahed drones. See, there's not that much time to think and act, right? This is an important part. Now,
Depends on how early you detect them, right? But
yeah, and we will go. Would be glad to go into that one. That's another can of worms. Unfortunately, this is the whole unfortunate reality of what I call unmanned air defense is the fact that it's very complicated and complex. But okay, so your drone, we're underneath the mothership now. We're releasing the drone, or let's just say it even releases it automatically because something came into the bounding box that we've defined on the map, and it starts flying. Okay, and now how do you hit the Shahed? How do you do it, right? So in the case of some other operations that have been performed, I can't go into exact details of which operations. In the case of some other operations that have been performed, months upon months, sometimes up to years, of training image recognition or computer vision systems have occurred, and then of basically repackaging and deploying software onto drones and giving them a lot of processing power, which, by the way, drives up the price of the drone dramatically, have been performed to make sure that they have a fallback to go and automatically hit a certain area of a target. These drones were still piloted by hand. Because the people that used them did not trust in the system getting the job done, and that's saying something by the people who are the most adept at this kind of the road towards autonomy. So we're releasing your drone now. It's in the sky above, let's say Latvia, and it's January. And it's night, and it's dark, and it's stormy, and it's snowy, and it's horrible. And your drone has maybe an IR seeker, it's infrared, trying to find the heat profile of the Shahed drone. Unfortunately, that push prop, simple Shahed drone that we're talking about it has a heat signature, but it's relatively small. It doesn't have communication with your radar station, which also has trouble keeping track of the shed due to its low radar cross section. And so it goes towards the drone, where it thinks the drone is, and it tries to find the drone. If it's very, very lucky, it will detect something that has a heat signature, and then it will go after it and try to hit it. It still needs to coordinate the insane amount of inputs that is piloting this drone, right? It still needs to do that all on its own. And guess what? Shaheds have started doing evasive maneuvers. Recently, the Gerbera drones that have been shot down have been found with cameras in their back, so that if interceptor drone pilots are chasing them, they can start evading them, and they want to automate that. But let's just say the chance of you hitting that Shahed drone in an automated way, in an automated fashion, I'd put right now at far below the chance of hitting the drone with a pilot that has things like intuition, things like a team around him that can help him make the right decisions, and so on and so forth. Autonomy basically means that the thing decides all on its own what to do, and that it does it really well. What we are looking at right now is very basic automation, and it's starting to work in Ukraine. It's probably going to take over at some point. We haven't crossed that threshold yet, and it's not something that I would bet our air defense on right now. There's a reason why this is currently not something that is legally prohibited within NATO. You know, the human in the loop, or human on the loop, as NATO calls it, directive is still part of our doctrine, and that's not going to change anytime very soon. So there needs to be a human piloting it, because these systems could just as well target something else if they're autonomous, for whatever that means. And basic automation is starting to work, but one, it is not autonomy, and two, it is absolutely not a silver bullet. It's not ready. It's not there yet. And it's very hard. You know, sorry, just one more tiny thing here. Anybody who has ever worked with computer vision systems or done machine learning and trained a system, I have done that a long time, for a long time, about a decade ago, knows that the amount of training data that you need to be able to perform computer vision for something that, a target, something you want to put a bounding box around, increases dramatically if the environment is not permissive. This is also one of the main reasons why companies that are building these kinds of technologies right now outside of Ukraine, and that don't have a direct link, if you will, into training in Ukraine under real conditions, are at an insane disadvantage. This is also why Ukraine, the country, is releasing its Shahed image data, a very large image data set for everybody, for the world to train on. They're not doing that because the problem is solved.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key things for me here is, which, I mentioned in so many conversations, really is the pure complexity of the environment. I mean, I cannot think of a more chaotic and unpredictable environment than, an active war zone, because it never comes as you expect it. And that is the very target of the opponent. And, you see how difficult real autonomous driving is in a civil setting where, there's a set of rules people follow generally, and then throwing an autonomous system at the most chaotic and challenging environment you can imagine. I mean, everyone who has a little bit of understanding of the technology involved there does understand that it is exceptionally challenging. But you've just perfectly shown that, yeah.
Let me jump back into that example, okay? So we've got a mothership in the air. We're releasing a drone. It's starting to fly, and it's moving around. It's maneuvering. It's trying to find its target. Okay, got fluctuating heat signatures. So heat signature, that's what, if it's got an IR infrared seeker, it will try and pick up the heat signature, which makes sense in quite a few scenarios. We've got fluctuating heat signatures. Why? Because we've got icy cold skies, and they're very complex. We may have some rain or some snow in there, and the thing has been moving around. Let's say it doesn't really fully know where its mothership is. How do we know it's not going to hit it? How do we make sure that it's really capable of, in this ultra complex environment, distinguishing the Shahed heat signature perfectly from the mothership drone heat signature, or other interceptor drones for that matter? These guys run at hundreds of kilometers per hour. They get warm. There are, and by the way, this is why it's so important to talk about integrated air defense. We might have way more expensive and valuable assets up in the air, like, for instance, pilots with airplanes. How do we make sure that doesn't get hit because it tries to hit the tries to hit that heat signature if it's flying slow enough, or a helicopter pilot, for instance. So it's very complicated. This is why I brought up the rice cooker as an example, because these systems, a rice cooker can determine when to stop cooking. And that's pretty nifty. How it does that is by the weight. That and there's a little magnet underneath anyway that basically helps close the electric loop or not. But it makes perfect rice every time. It stops cooking when there is not much more water in the rice cooker, when the water has evaporated. And so I think a better way to talk about and to learn about these systems is that they are, we're trying to train them, which is, it's deterministic. We're trying to train them to react to certain sensory thresholds, that they perceive, and then to perform certain actions. It's an if this then that kind of thing. It is not a situation where the drone is trying to understand the situation. That's not what this is. And by the way, we might not want that in the first place, because that introduces a ton of other complexities. If it's trying to understand the situation, we might have put an NVIDIA Jetson Orin into that thing. We might have put that, it could get very expensive. And that is very much not conducive to this whole idea of affordable precision, which is exactly what the core paradigm of this entire new age of warfare is about. So might want to have these systems to be relatively stupid, but very, very highly effective. And that's maybe a better way to steer the conversation. And I wholeheartedly agree with what you said about the skies being and navigation by sight being extremely complex.
Yeah. And I think the next thing we really need to dive into is just, also based on what you just said and described there, it is about finding the right mixture out of, precision, price, how dumb or intelligent is it actually, or does it actually needs to be. But the key for me there is to understand layered defense, something you've been mentioning multiple times in the conversation already. Can you give an introduction to what do you mean by layered defense, and what would that mean for this so-called drone wall? And also something I probably just want to mention at this point of time. Now, you only described one single scenario, which is an air threat. But we all know that this is not all there is. There's ground threats, there's air threats, there's, naval threats by now, and God knows what else. So just keeping that in mind, that a drone wall is not just air defense. And so, back to you. What do you understand under layered defense?
Yeah, it's a gigantic topic, especially now that you're bringing in layered defense as a whole. Let me start with air defense to stick to that. That's already so complex. Let me start with that, and then we can build on that. So, first of all, air defense is built on a couple of very simple principles. You want to be able to detect and track, and then mitigate threats. There you go. Very simple, right? And In the case of layered air defense, and especially layered air defense that also incorporates defense against unmanned systems, which, by the way, have been around for a very long time. First cruise missiles are about 50 years old. In the case of layered air defense that also goes against unmanned systems, we need to think about air defense as sort of like an onion first, where you have long-range air defense, you have mid-range air defense, short-range air defense, and then very short-range air defense, or VSHORAD, because people in defense like crazy acronyms. It's also called close-in air defense, if you want another one. And the idea here is that there are certain threats that you can detect and mitigate at certain distances. Now, you always want to be able to mitigate a threat at the highest distance. A very important reason for that is just one cool example that recently was brought up by a colleague of mine was if, for instance, one of these newer Shahed drones does a dive on you, so dives at almost a right angle onto a target. If it does a dive and it's going to come down with some 600, 700, maybe even more kilometers per hour, that's easily, well in the mid cruise missile speed there, lower mid, then if you shoot that thing, you still have a glowing ball of metal coming at you. That is there's still something that might hit you. So how do you mitigate that? Back to the overall picture of layered air defense, as I said, it's like an onion where we have different measures for detection and tracking for different distances. We might be using, for instance, something like space-based or air-based tracking and radar to track things that are further out. We might be using radar arrays or phased array radars for things that are in the mid-range, and in the closer range, we might be using something like visual tracking systems on top of that, because we have what's called line of sight, or VLOS, if you want another crazy acronym. And so we have very, very, very different measures to detect and track these systems. Oh, and by the way, let me just add one more thing here to that, which I brought up in this example of Ukraine that the Unmanned Systems Forces communicated to me. Audio arrays are becoming a thing, microphone arrays to detect aerial threats. Because, for instance, these Shahed drones, they're also called mopeds by Ukrainians, because that's the sound that they make as they approach. That's a pretty horrible thing. If you've ever been there and experienced that, it doesn't make it much better, but they're very loud, and that's great. So you can hear them, right? And then also something that has been worked on a lot recently, and I can see expand a lot more in the future, are ways of improving our air defense accuracy and how early we can detect and track something by using machine learning and artificial intelligence. So basically, how can you maybe pick up just a tiny little, I'm looking at the sky right now, how can you pick up just tiny little differences in movement of pixels and see that might be a flying threat that is otherwise, doesn't have enough of a radar cross section or is not visible to the human eye. So all of these, and by the way, all of these systems need to be integrated, and that's where we also now have so-called command and control systems. First of all, we have sensor fusion, and then systems that try to basically denoise the amount of data, big data, as it's called, that to make sense what is actually signal, what is noise, and then by the way, on top of that, we need to also discuss maybe at some point how electronic warfare plays into this, and how some electronic warfare is trying to increase the signal to the noise to signal ratio, how we're also trying to detect systems using RF communication if they're using it, which few are these days. But so we've got all these means to detect and track something. Then we've got systems that perform the sensor fusion and give us some compressed sort of insights. Ideally nowadays with systems like Citaware used by NATO, they put that on a map and I could see stuff. And then you've got a command and control structure to go with that, which is still comprised very much, to the even though few people want to hear it, it's very much comprised of people that need to be trained. That training takes years, and it's not like we have enough of those to just spread them out across the entire border that we keep mentioning. And then you have an actual decision making and kill chain where you go ahead and make a decision to deploy a certain measure, ideally the appropriate measure. What does that mean? That means that it has a favorable cost exchange ratio, but also, and more importantly than that, it has actually a very high chance of actually taking down the target, without any collateral damage. And you deploy the measure, which could then be manned or unmanned. And I want to make this point very important, unmanned systems have been around for many, many decades. In fact, the long history goes back to even World War I, with remote piloted systems. And you deploy a countermeasure, and that then ideally destroys the target. There's another thing that is also an important paradigm in land-based defense, which is called defense in depth. What does that mean? This is important. This is why we have the onion. That means you want to try and stop a threat as early as possible. By the way, and this is where it gets very complex, that's not always the case, because for some stuff, just give one pointy example here. Israel, during the brief war or whatever it was with Iran, actually shot down some of the Shaheds. Those were mostly the old ones, the 136s, or Geran 2, as Russia calls them, with helicopters and guns. As by the way Ukraine is doing. So sometimes you also want to, you can stop the thing before it hits you, so you don't have to act the moment that it enters your sphere of awareness, your picture. But most of the time, you might want to stop a threat, especially if it's more dangerous. You might want to stop it as early as possible, and then you want to pick the thing that you have, enough of, and stop it at a favorable cost exchange ratio. Now, you just mentioned, obviously, that that's just one thing attacking. And with the saturation attack, we suddenly have a whole different monster in front of us, something that we do not know anymore, and yet at the same time. Because there have been saturation attacks, like saturation bombing and stuff like that, strategic bombing attacks in World War II from the air, but that's not how that works anymore in many cases, especially not with unmanned systems warfare that we're seeing now. And so we need to adjust to a whole different scenario for saturated air attack situations. And that's where we need to rethink our air defense layers and think about which countermeasures in those layers are actually appropriate for which kinds of threats. But I'll maybe stop here for a second, let you say something. Otherwise, I'll just keep going forever.
No, it's wonderful. It's a very easy episode for me because I can just keep going.
Please stop me.
I think all the points you're making are absolutely critical here. Where my brain goes right now is, understood the overall complexity is extreme. And
it's nuts.
Although, Ukraine is at the forefront of development, I'm thinking right now about overall NATO defense. Why? I mean, we see obviously Russia testing out what we can and what we cannot on a whole different range than we've been seeing it over the last year, let's say. Drones over Denmark, all over the place, Poland, you name it. And, just yesterday, as of where we're recording it, unknown drones across the airport in Munich. No one really knows where they came from, what they are. Obviously, we can't say that everything is Russia driven or whatever, but it's reaching new levels of threat all over the place rather than only in Ukraine. Now, we keep saying, oh, it would be a different war if we would be involved and all that stuff. But at the same time, I'm thinking about the industries and the technologies we are looking at. And in a previous episode, as great as a job as companies like Rheinmetall do as system integrators for these really complex systems, they also have been very honest. The Timo I spoke with has been very honest, saying, look, the forefront innovation is not what Rheinmetall can do. It's just not what they're good at. It's not what they're set up for. And then the question for me is, we're seeing ourselves confronted with a massive, almost tech war. Yeah, it's technology driven. It is not just hardware, but it's also software driven, heavily software enabled and driven. So what that brings my mental conclusion to is, the large primes maybe are not in a position to fully approach these new threats, which are evolving at such a rapid speed that I would question large companies being able to keep up with all of these developments. Does that mean our security and safety is in the hands of startups and scale-ups? And I mean, it's an open and honest question. And the second then is, well, if that would be the case, or even something close to that assumption would be the case, where are we there today in Europe? Where are we when it comes to technology white spots? I mean, we've just spent lots of time to explore the technical challenges there, but there's a whole other beast behind finding a solution, building this layered system, and then supplying that system in volumes which actually make a difference. Because everyone can, have this tiny area and say, oh, right, it's safe now. But yeah, it's 4,000 kilometers of border. Like, how many systems do you need? How does your manufacturing process look like? How stable are your supply chains to external entities? And so that's where my head is going right now. And maybe I'm just going down a rabbit hole. But what are your thoughts on that? Is any of that? Does any of that make sense to you?
I turned down 90% I turned down 99% of all pitch decks that are sent to me, but I turned down 90% of pitch decks and companies because they don't have a flying clue about production or supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
They're not even thinking about that. And I think that the vacuum, the large gap that exists today in potentially scaling these emerging solutions is one of the largest threats to our security that we have ever faced. And I mean ever in hundreds of years. And I'm angry about that because and it's easy to get angry about that because there are just so many people you can get angry at. So, just
Of course.
Yeah. So, for instance, I can be angry about our policy and procurement leaders because there aren't enough purchase contracts, market signals, any of those. There aren't enough requests for proposals, tenders, purchase contracts. There isn't enough volume that's being bought. As a matter of fact, I can even say that the way that we buy stuff is just setting us up for disaster. And I'm happy to elaborate on that. But that
Please do.
All right. And I can also be angry at everybody else in the market, but let me go to that first. Okay. So the half-life of a system, let's say half-life, the use of a system until its next iteration is being developed, produced, and deployed in Ukraine is weeks. That is for hardware. And I'm saying not weeks, not 12 weeks, 2 weeks. That's just for hardware. These are software-driven, software-defined systems. The rate at which we see tactical changes You know, the way that a drone operates, the way that a drone flies, the way that an unmanned ground vehicle flies, drives. I want to see that.
That's the next evolution stage, huh?
I keep thinking about flying spiders when I say that. The way that these systems behave, the way that they detect and evade threats and dangers, that is evolving on a daily basis. Some of the folks that I'm in touch with are basically near or at the front line, not front line 0, which is right the middle between the two. Anyway, but you know, around 50 kilometers from where the middle between the two trenches is. Every day or every other day, they're out there. Why? They're sitting in the bunkers and in the positions with the drone pilots. We're just talking about FPVs and UGVs, so unmanned ground vehicles now. FPVs, I don't know, first-person view drones, so basic quadcopters. And anything that is like fixed wing, short range, and mid range drones. These are all being launched from that distance, right? These guys are down there every single day. That's not something I'm seeing in the European industry, and that's not, you know. So on one hand, we're not buying the right stuff. Let's just say, for example, okay, if a country, I'm not going to name any names here, but if a country's MOD puts out a request for proposals, a tender, okay, they want to buy whatever 10,000 strike drones. Okay, a country putting out such a proposal, any proposal that I have seen, any tender, any procurement tender that is being put out by NATO nations, with very few exceptions that are very recent, almost too recent to judge. Every single procurement tender that's being put out is for completely outdated technology.
Mm-hmm.
The reason for that is inherent to the system, to how we have been procuring for a long time, not forever, but for the time of the peacetime dividend that we have been enjoying now, where we made, you know, all those fancy systems, which is we sit down and we have a thought about, you know, planning. We plan how future war will look like, and then, you know, what will be gaps and things that we might need in our force composition that we need to have. And then, okay, we sit down and we think about how the technology might look like. We might ask one or two folks from the industry. Note that I'm not mentioning the warfighter, because they largely don't get asked. Unfortunately, most of our warfighters also do not have recent warfighting experience. That's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good on one hand, but it's also very bad on the other, because then how do they know what exactly they need? And then after years, very often years, and you know, not a few years, a contract is being issued, and then a company starts ramping up production, acquiring like some debt money, maybe for debt funding for increasing production. They start retooling and tooling their factories and training their workers, and they start delivering whatever it is. And then what you end up in the end is something like the Eurodrone.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually a drone. A procurement that we've made, you know. And without necessarily wanting to go too deep into it, it just hurts too much. That thing costs as much. The Eurodrone costs as much as about 3 times the annual defense budget of Lithuania, of the country of Lithuania. They cost about 104. I don't have the exact number. It's about between 140 and 170 million euros per pop a piece. It is. I need to look it up again, but I think it's 13 tons of wet mass. So we're talking about a weight of 13 tons, some 20, 30 meters wingspan. It flies at the same speed of a Shahed drone, and it will never ever see service anywhere near it is needed for reconnaissance, for instance, you know, for intelligence.
Or it will be shot down immediately.
intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, which is also called ISR, exactly. So that's the thing. This thing is basically as close to a fat sitting duck as it gets, right? And it's also a beautiful target. I mean, by the way, the the unmanned systems forces, I think it was even Wild Hornets, the guys who also make the Sting drone. And this is something we need to talk about, is how these drones actually came about in Ukraine, how they're being innovated and made, because that's nothing like we are doing it here at all, even now. But these guys just took out a Russian drone, which is called Orion, which has just about these specs. It only costs a fraction because it's not made in Europe, but it has about these specs. Oh, by the way, have I mentioned that the Eurodrone is years over time and over budget? I think the budget has been increased by 1.4 billion again. They've shifted it out from 2027 to 2030 now. They're hinting at it only being ready in 2035. But guess what? It is a jack of all trades, at least that, right? And it reminds me of the procurement of, I wasn't there to see it. That happened before my time, but there's actually a movie about it, which I recommend everybody to watch. It's amazing, a comedy movie, because that's the only way to make it digestible, about the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, which started out as an APC, an armored personnel carrier, and then just evolved into this thing, which has way more armor, and it has rockets, and it has this gun and that gun, and it's insane. And even only now, after it's been iterated 5, 6, 7 times, it actually has seen some good use and some success in Ukraine. But that's because the actual way that war works has shifted in its favor. It hasn't. It's not good because it was designed well or procured well. It's good because of serendipity and chance just evolved into its direction.
What's the name of that movie? Is it the Bradley?
Yeah, I was what? Sorry, is it what?
Was it? What is the name of the movie?
I thought you had suggested one. My memory is very bad. I need to look it up again. Give me one. I could Google it right now if you want to, but maybe we do that afterwards.
We do that afterwards.
Yeah, exactly.
You'll find it in the show notes. I'll make sure of that. But there's actually something I don't hear the first time, because over specification comes as at a very, very high price. And generally, if you look at some of our products, and some, you can argue there is reason for it. But if you look at how warfighting looks today, where it is, more a volume than a quality game, over so many spectrums, it is a very, very, very resource inefficient way to have a handful of, yes, qualitatively very high, massively overspec'd entities or units. But, if the potential enemy has 200 times the systems, it doesn't matter, because they just outweigh you until you have shot all of your fantastic long-range missiles, and then they're like, well, we know you don't have the manufacturing capability. Sorry that I have to come back to that again. And we know that you don't have the supply chain to keep it up for any meaningful time for us to withstand your counterattacks to some extent. And that my one of my recent obsessions is supply chains in the industry and across Europe. So it is quite disturbing to see all of this coming together at the same time, and it almost feels like a hole we have digged over the last decades almost, which it will be very, very challenging to come out of. And just to round up the procurement point, it still feels to me like there's, I understand there's regulation and there's law and there's rules, and they are there for a reason. But at the same time, it still feels to me like oftentimes we are pretending when it comes to procurement like we would still be in peace times. And even the current procurement systems or contracts being handed out with still very loose specification when it comes to timelines. It's not like we can afford, like it has been 10 years ago, oh, it doesn't really matter when these tanks come, and it doesn't really matter how much over budget you go. It does. Every single day matters, as far as I'm concerned. But I'll stop my rant here.
No, I want to let me rant on for you, and I want to maybe we can also turn this around and talk about how to do it better. It's like
Yes,
one thing, which is something
please.
I don't like people that are just dumping on the industry and on procurement all the time. I want to also think about pathways and solutions. So I'm happy to share those too,
Yes,
because there are
please.
some. But before that, let me just do a final headbutt here, which is. So I was lucky to be in the United States when the space industry became commercial, and to work in the space industry, and that taught me a few lessons, and to work with some of the folks that actually made built the commercial space industry and architected it. And to give you just one example that is really very much speaking to your supply chain point there. So why did the Department of Defense choose Star Shields, which is Starlink, but for the defense sector? Why did they choose it? They could have chosen any of the decades long established geosynchronous communication satellite operators. The infrastructure is there. I mean, they're using part of it anyway. Why did they choose a low Earth orbit solution, which has, the need for tons more satellites that you constantly need to put up there? It's very simple, and this is one of the main paradigms that just gets. People say they get it, and then they turn around and they do something else. They act like they don't. It's because it's proliferated. It is because it is proliferated, right? And there's actually a program in the United States by the DoD, which a company that I work with has just received a contract for. I'm very proud of. It's called the Proliferated Warfighter Space Architecture, or PWSA, and you can't speak that without spelling it, unfortunately. And that's the whole idea of having a proliferated, a dispersed architecture, so that when one gets hit, the system stays resilient. This is a bit of a non-term misnomer in the defense industry, but I'm talking about a system that can sustain itself in its operation, even if parts of it have been taken out, like a plant. What we are building right now are basically more like a mammal. You take out the mammal's gone. You chop off part of a tree, the tree keeps going on. Or you look at something like other distributed systems like ants, ant colonies. And it is, the reason why SpaceX was chosen, the reason why SpaceX was such an easy choice for the Department of Defense, for the Space Force, is because SpaceX showed that it can produce, at scale.
Mm-hmm.
It will be able to keep churning out. And because there's nobody else who can provide the launch numbers that SpaceX has to churn out and shoot up these satellites, right? And we can see it working. It's working, And this is why this whole idea of distributed and proliferated systems, and that means of very much commercialized supply chains, We're talking about not bespoke, manual, years-long production of systems, but of machine-based production, tool-based production, of robotic production, of production out of simpler materials, because you're gonna defense expenditure is not something to brag about in terms of economic growth, because your investment, the actual thing that grows, is going to get blown up. Right? It's just not like.
Well, there will be some knowledge and technology spillovers at some point.
What I mean is basically, but if you're aware that this is going to get blown up, and if you're aware that what's coming at you now and in the near future, and I mean, by now everybody should have gotten the memo that came with the punch on the nose, is that a stream of smart matter, then why on earth would you not invest into an infrastructure and into a supply chain? And I mean, and we can talk about what that means to invest into that actually produces that as a countermeasure, right? So There is an absolutely clear point about that makes so much sense. And I could go on and on. Russia is running out of air defense systems right now. They just asked Turkey to give them back or sell them back an S-300 air defense battery. They're running out of those because they are very, very high value targets. So Ukrainians take them out. They have very concentrated firepower. What we need is distributed, proliferated firepower. And for that, we need the appropriate commercial supply chain. I rest my case.
No, wonderful. So I think, when we jump on the solution side of things,
yeah,
maybe let's focus on the top 3 to 5 things that need to change, how they need to change, and also please at any point of time learning from Ukraine more than welcome, because I think it's probably the best place to learn at the moment.
So when we're talking about solutions, the first important question is, are we talking about things or are we talking about ways of doing things, right? And I would say it's a mix of the two. It has to be a mix of the two, because both, as I said, mentioned multiple times now, we don't have the things and we're not doing things the right way. So we need to learn both. We need to learn that very fast. This is learning on the job, if you will, or learning under fire, as it's being called. So in terms of the solutions, the very first thing is what I would call kinetic development. And this is the most important thing. I have alluded to this a number of guests on this podcast, and everybody out there is saying the same thing. Few people are doing it, which is, you can't just do research and development anymore. That's just over. You don't research. It sounds crazy. I mean, and that's a longer term perspective that we need. We will keep wanting to have this kind of perspective, but there's just no time for that. You ask anyone in Ukraine that are, Ukrainians that are adapting to these drone incursions, to the mass drone attacks every single day, and they'll tell you, what do you mean research? We don't have time for that. They adapt on the fly, and for that, you need to go into an infight with your enemy if you want it or not. The more we try to, distance ourselves from the war by sending money to Ukraine, which all of these things make sense. I'm not saying they don't, but the more we do that, the less we learn. Being on the ground and learning with the people. I mentioned the example. I actually earlier had a call with that fella from a European drone manufacturer who was just in the trenches. That's just how. And this sounds. Some people say, but Mark, that's really not realistic. I'm saying, okay, cool. Well, then, just get out of the way. There are enough people that are ready to go that far. They need to be in the spotlight. They need to get the resources, and they're adapting their systems at this pace. So first thing that I would say is, and I'm just coining it now, kinetic development, really going into the infight, learning there.
I think this has an input, which is courage. Because, just what you described, you need the people which have the courage to do exactly that. And I'm by now, you earlier used the word, you're angry. I'm angry at people which are still so delusional and trying to keep the vast population delusional of saying, oh, you can't say that we are in a hybrid war. That is, you're scaring
that
people.
Makes me angry too. That makes me that makes me so angry it distracts me from answering your prior question. Because the thing is one thing that Ukraine, the core reason why Ukraine has survived the war thus far, and has been able to hold back a far outmatching enemy, is because in playing a much, much unfairer game, by the way, is because they have what's called a whole of society approach. And that means that there is very broad education. If most European prime contractor managers and startup founders have never been to Ukraine. That's a shame. And I mean that in the proverbial sense, as in you should feel ashamed about not having done that. If you enter Ukraine, which is by train because the skies are closed, well, they're not closed, but at least there are
Or
no
bus.
flights, or bus, yeah, or
I
walking
had the
even.
pleasure of that as well.
Yeah, the bus ride is a bit of anyway, or even walking. But if you enter Ukraine, one of the first things that you'll encounter are screens that show, things like, for instance, cyber threat education, informational warfare education for the public. And by the way, they're made so funny and so cool and so well designed that they draw you in. They're well done. They don't seem anything like what most European governments would put out.
Yeah, it's just
Why?
like the marketing of the brigades. So it's
But
unbelievable quality.
exactly. Very good point. I was just recently on the phone with. I thought I had my badge over here. I was just recently on the phone with a friend from Azov, talking about this. I can't find it, which is exactly how that all came about. And we can talk about the history of that as well. But and why is that? Why is this important? It's important because the whole society, all of society, is contributing to this by being one swarm brain and muscle. That is why Ukraine has been able to hold back the hordes of what they call the orcs for very obvious reasons. This is a very important point that is unfortunately overlooked. We think we can just throw, NATO R&D budgets, national R&D budgets against this problem. We can't. That's not how that's going to work. Why? Because this proliferated threat that is coming at us is evolving so fast that whatever we're developing will be outdated by that time. So number one, kinetic development. Number two is really, in my humble opinion, to get our warfighters into the hands of companies and to get the company's products into the hands of the warfighters. That is not something at all which is happening at any even remotely respectable scale in Europe right now. And that is a real problem because these warfighters, guess what? Many of them actually are in touch with Ukrainian colleagues. These warfighters have, guess what? Other than the people who are, especially for the startups, founding new companies, most of them have warfighting experience, right? They know a little bit about the operational contexts that certain weapons will be used in. And let's just not forget, FPVs came about because of a lack of artillery. What Ukraine did there with the quadcopters was nothing but take a DJI Phantom. Actually, back then, in the beginning, they just took a Phantom and a GoPro and an RF receiver, and they put a mortar shell, which was available because they didn't have the artillery shells, put that on that and flew it into the tank. It flew it into the target. So getting the warfighters involved in this, which have been neglected so heavily during our peacetime and the peacetime dividend that we have enjoyed, is so important because planners and requirements writers tend to plan and write in relative isolation.
Mm.
And that means that the solutions that they actually procure are fatally decoupled from reality. So warfighters, way more, and we've got so many soldiers in Europe, easily, what is it? Something like 2.4, 2.67 million, including all of the reservists. Most of these people right now, many of these people right now are relegated to what's being called in defense tactical waiting. So that they could really use some nice, interesting exercise, drill, test activity, and many of them, I speak with a lot of them myself constantly. They would love to. So let's get those people something to play with and increase our learning speed and speed of iteration and shorten our feedback loops in the process. I do not understand why some European militaries are being extremely hawkish and they seem to be parenting their warfighters from being in touch with industry, as if that would be the worst thing in the world. That's not good. And then I think the last thing, and this is relatively high level, and if you want to, we can also go on down to specific solutions, but this is the 3 high level points that I would make about what to learn from Ukraine. So kinetic development, be near the front. The second thing, get our warfighters involved. They already know way more than you, me, and most people that are in the industry. And then the third thing is imagine a scenario, a situation, okay, where you have a threat. The threat is relatively well defined. Unfortunately, it's evolving at the speed of sound, but it's relatively well defined. And you have a ton of solutions, anywhere from expedient, improvised to refined. Okay, you've got this. Imagine you had this scenario, and then let's imagine you had all the money in the world and then some. And now imagine you would not try to put those two things together and use the actual things that have been developed, you know? So trying to get Ukraine has a program for this. It's called Built with Ukraine, trying to get Ukrainian solutions. They're opening up exports now as well, trying to get Ukrainian solutions over here, right over here. In my case, you know, being in Berlin, you over in the UK, getting those solutions over here and starting to use them, to play with them. Almost nothing I see coming from European startups can hold a candle to the Ukrainian counterparts and solutions that are out there. So let's learn, you know, that's not so hard. And the Ukraine has learned a lot. They're very open in sharing that. You could talk to startups, to companies, to founders, to engineers down there at a number of events via LinkedIn, via all the other platforms. We're not taking this opportunity by the horns.
I think this is, you know, you're making fantastic points there, because it's actually something I've been encountering throughout the entire military, which until today shocks me. That, you know, if you speak with the guys and say like, okay, how do you guys make sure that you take the learnings from what is going on, and not you know, very often the answer is we don't really. I mean, it might be relevant for our higher up generals, but, you know, we just do the same thing that we always do. I'm like, okay, that is concerning. And, you know, all of this learning, I think I always, not always, but sometimes I even feel that there's a little bit of arrogance involved, of like, oh, what are they going to teach us? Which I think is very foolish at one point. And I think we need to empower intersectional learning all over the place, because what you obviously have been describing is from Ukraine into Europe. But I also think within Europe, there's lots of silos we need to break up as well. You know, one is, you know, just universities, like civil clauses and all of that stuff. Cross-learning between industries, meaning civil and defense and universities and procurement and the military itself. I think there's lots of communication or missing communication, which needs to improve massively. And obviously, taking it from the guys which are the absolute leaders can leap all of our innovation and technology speed into a whole new range, which, you know, given the speed in which threats are evolving around us, I quite frankly think we don't even have another. It's not an optional to speak to the guys which are already living in it. Yeah, I think that you're making fantastic points there.
I'm sorry for interrupting, but I also want to counter that point. Like, so let me just argue against myself for a second here. Bear with me. Yeah, we should learn from Ukraine. I mean, it's, you know, almost a waste of air even saying that. If anybody who doesn't get that yet shouldn't be allowed in the room. But yes, we should learn from Ukraine, but over-indexing on using Ukrainian solutions, on building copies of Ukrainian solutions, will not deter. It will not help us. And so we are caught in this weird limbo where we really, we don't come close to even this, to anywhere close to the state of the art that can just so hold back the enemy in Ukraine. And I mean that both in quality and in quantity. And I would even say in expected quantity, as in like let's just say we pump a lot of money into it. We wouldn't be able to scale like that. Not easily enough. But at the same time, we're also producing things that are very much too Ukraine-like.
Mm-hmm.
To help for our cause. I meant we went, long and wide, far and wide over the example of interceptors and of automation, of the fact that these will still for quite some time need to be piloted. And so what exactly do we do to build that drone wall? We've got a cool, 4,300 kilometers times, let's just say 10 kilometers in altitude. That's what 43,000 square kilometers. So how do we protect that? Using stuff that will likely not look like what Ukraine is using because we don't have the amount of drone pilots, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we do that, right? We're at this point in time where we need to find out what our solution looks like, right? And a lot of the companies, a lot of the startups out there right now basically consist of false claims of autonomy and commoditized ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question here is, who's going to fuel that? Who's going to fuel that wave of companies and startups? If we assume for a second that the prime contractors are not culturally not perfectly suited, you said Timo has admitted to prime contractors not being perfectly suited culturally for being the vanguards in the spearhead, the bridgehead in terms of unmanned systems. If they are not, then it actually falls back to the SMEs, the startups, the scale-ups. Okay, but if what they are producing is mostly claims of autonomy and then commoditized parts put together, who's going to fund that? And it basically brings us back to a point which is that wartime economies and wartime production look vastly different than peacetime economies and peacetime productions. And we are currently in a stasis, in a hesitant stasis between those two conditions. So we're not in a wartime economy, but we also don't feel like we can do the peacetime economy still. And in a wartime economy, it doesn't really matter if what you are going to build has a lot of commoditized subsystems and parts in it. That I don't care. I wanted to make go bang and go bang hard enough that our enemy goes away. That's what I want. I don't care if, let's just take the venture capital perspective. I don't care if there's an amazing IP moat in there. I don't care. I care that it goes bang and makes the enemy go away. And so, and I'm honestly, I'm not going to say I have a solution to this and I have an answer, but I feel this is one of the biggest questions that we need to ask ourselves philosophically right now. Is sort of let's say, I think 99% of unmanned vehicle startups are critically overvalued. And if you think about it, most of the unmanned vehicles, be it UAVs or even UGVs, are commodities. They are hardened toys with better sensors, better communication, and some software snapped onto it. The equivalent of those systems in Ukraine is most of the time put together out of commercial off-the-shelf or COTS, as hopefully no Germans are listening, COTS parts, and open source software, like the software that is being used to fly a lot of the and command a lot of the FPVs out there and any of the short to mid-range strike drones is Ardu Pilot. That's Ardu Pilot. It's an Arduino, this is open source software. So if that is what helps Ukraine win the war, and if Ukraine can do things like have solutions that are on heavy rotation all the time, they've got mothership drones because they fly them all the time, every day. How does our response to this threat, which obviously is now starting to incur and starting to become very kinetic, how does our response look like, both from an investment perspective, what do we do? How do we stimulate venture capital where it is needed? What do we do for all of the many other things that we need that don't really require or aren't perfect for venture capital? And then from an industry perspective, how do we stimulate people making stuff that is not many people coming in from the startup world doesn't have a moat, doesn't have an IP, you can't patent what you make. How do we stimulate people making that? How do we invest into supply chain and production? I think those are unanswered questions. I don't even know how I got to that point. I got off on a little bit of a detour here. Please bring me back on track. my rant,
No,
my rant is over.
no. I think asking the right questions is the first step to finding the right solutions, and so you did just that. So everyone listening in here, you have your further research pipelines you can go down, or rabbit holes you can go down, and propose solutions. Now, look, I think we could probably talk about this for days and days and days, but I think we've spoken about so many different critically important things today. We covered the drone wall and how we stand around this. I think we made very, very clear how critical it is that we are very closely watching what is going on in Ukraine, that we think about how we procure and what needs to be done to get our armies trained up, and many, many other things, quite frankly. Is there anything which we have not discussed yet, or one last thing, if the listeners only take one thing or maybe two things with them after our probably record-breaking long conversation on this podcast, then what are those things you would really want everyone to walk away with after this conversation?
Good question. I believe the most important thing is that we roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty, that we go where it hurts, where it's a bit dangerous, to make things that actually work, that we expose ourselves and try to be humble. Right now, there's no drone wall. And if we keep going in the same direction that we are that we are walking into now and have been walking into, there will not be a drone wall. So we need to be very humble and ask ourselves a couple of very hard questions, and then we need to be open to not do the European thing and go back to the drawing board and design and paint and some very, very beautiful picture, but we need to just shoehorn something together and use it right away, break it, stress it, and try and find out what doesn't work about it, and then keep building on that. And that is something that I would also love for our governments and our government entities to support, basically failure. Ukraine didn't arrive at a point where it can hold back, and in some cases and in some parts really dominate Russian aggression. It didn't arrive at that point by going back to the drawing board. It arrived at that point by iterating under fire. Right now, most people in Europe are far too business oriented. That is not what wins wars. And that is an important thing to note. Business doesn't win wars. And it won't keep our adversaries out of our skies. What we need is a bigger stick or more sticks, and we need to show that we can actually act against the threat and that we can decisively and rapidly respond to the threat and put a stop to it. We can, if we think about this from a different perspective, and I'm basically saying if we MacGyver this, okay? If anybody's old enough to remember MacGyver. If we MacGyver this, if we just experiment, if we get back to tinkering, and if we support that on an industry level, we can basically show to our adversary that it will be more expensive for them, way more expensive for them if they attack us, even if we beat back. And that would be the thing that again, there's a clear path towards this, and we can get there if we just concentrate on this being a supply chain problem, on this being a production problem, on this being a rapid iteration problem.
Marc, thank you so much for taking the time and sharing all of your insights and your wisdom with us. Please keep up the great work, and I'm sure we speak very soon again about so many other different challenges and how they have evolved. Thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks.